Welcome to the Dialogue Book Report, where we talk about books and literature of interest to LDS readers, part of the Dialogue Podcast Network. I'm Andrew Hall, the Literature Book Review Editor at Dialogue, Journal of Mormon Thought, coming to you from Fukuoka, Japan. And today we're going to have a discussion about poetry, and our guest host today is Elizabeth Garcia, the poetry editor for Dialogue. She was the previous poetry editor for Sigala, a contributor to Fire in the Pasture, 21st Mormon Century Poets, which we may talk about today. And her first chapbook, Stunt Double, was published in 2015. Elizabeth.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to do this. This is kind of fun because I have corresponded over the last how many years with Dayna on different things and with Tyler. And so this is a fun way to actually speak to you guys and get to know you a little bit. So I was hoping tonight that I could give each of you some time to talk about your most recent book, some of your influences, share some of the things that maybe most readers might not pick up on that you can kind of, dumb it down a little bit for most of us. And then I wanted to take some time to talk about Mormon poetry. And I know, both collaborated on the Dove song, Poems on Heavenly Mother, maybe talk a little bit about that. And some other things that you're working on currently. So welcome. We're happy to have you guys here.
Let's introduce them. So we have two of our great poets with us today, Dayna Patterson and Tyler Chadwick. Liz, do you want to introduce them?
Yes. So I'm going to start with Dayna. Here is Dayna Patterson. She is a photographer, textile artist, and irreverent bardophile. She's the author of Titania and Yellow by Porkbelly Press, 2019, and If Mother Braids a Waterfall by Signature Books, 2020. Her honors include the Association for Mormon Letters Poetry Award and a 2019 Dignity Not Detention Poetry Prize judged by Ilya Kaminsky. Her creative work has appeared in Iccotheo, Canyon Review, and Poetry. She's the founding editor, now emerita, of Psaltery and Lyre, and a co-editor of Dove Song, Heavenly Mother, and Mormon Poetry. She lives with her husband and two daughters in a little patch of enchanted forest in the Pacific Northwest. And then we also have Tyler Chadwick, who is, I think most people know who Tyler is, an award-winning writer, editor, and teacher who received his PhD in English and the teaching of English from Idaho State University. He teaches writing at Utah Valley University and has 4 books to his name, 2 anthologies, Fire in the Pasture, 21st Century Mormon Poets, and Dove Song, Heavenly Mother, and Mormon Poetry, and a collection of poetry and essays, field notes on language and kinship. His most recent book is Litany with Wings, published by BCC Press in 2022. He lives in Ogden, Utah with his wife, Jess, and their 4 daughters. So welcome, both of you. I wanted to give each of you some time to share about your collection and, talk about what went into its creation. So I thought I'd start with ladies first, Dayna. I guess start by telling us a little bit about your book. It's called Oh Lady Speak Again by Signature Books. And I wanted you to, give us a little bit, kind of a, one-liner about what it's about, but then tell us a little bit about what questions and preoccupations drove you to create it. If you would share some of that with us.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and Tyler. Thank you for having both of us on this evening. I'm really excited to chat, and I appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to prepare some questions for us. And I'm excited to talk about this book. It's been out for 2 weeks, maybe a week and a half. So it still feels very surreal to be holding it in my hands. And but yeah, I wrote it for my graduate program at Western Washington University. I did the MFA in creative writing. And actually, when I started the program, I had about 70 pages worth of poems that I thought was going to be my first book.
Mm-hmm.
They were poems that were interested in Shakespeare and motherhood mostly, and interrogating some of the female roles in Shakespeare. Of those 70 pages, 2 poems made it into Oh Lady.
Wow, 70 pages is a collection by itself.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
I thought that I already had a book. So
Right.
yeah, so the 2 poems that made it in are both revised as well.
Okay.
So it was a huge time of, I feel like, growth as a poet for me.
I can
And
imagine.
it was quite a journey. But yeah, the book, like, I started getting interested in Shakespeare at about the same time that I became a mom. So those interests are kind of coming together, and I was thinking about my own mom who had 3 babies in 3 years, suffered from extreme postpartum depression, and left my family. So that comes into this book a little bit, and thinking
Yes.
about there are so many families in Shakespeare where there is no mother.
Right.
It's a father with a daughter, or a father with daughters, like King Lear, or Prospero in The Tempest with his Miranda. So that, yeah. So I started imagining myself into some of those roles, and my story. And then another thing that happened as I was writing or getting ready to write these poems is I had what I will call a faith crisis. I know that not everybody likes the term faith crisis, or prefers something like faith journey, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, it did feel quite crisisy.
Sure.
This book starts with a shipwreck. It starts with the shipwreck that Miranda sees at the beginning of The Tempest. She's looking out of the ocean and she sees this terrible shipwreck, and she runs to her father Prospero and has said, "Is there any magic that you can use to stop the shipwreck that is happening?" So that shipwreck that begins the book is a metaphor for my own feeling of how the faith crisis felt to me. And I'm still on a spiritual journey, and it's not over, and I respect everybody's individual spiritual journeys. I want to say that I did not, and I do not write to convince anybody to leave Mormonism or to stay in Mormonism. I feel like that is a deeply personal journey for everybody.
Yeah.
But those are some of the concerns, and that's a lot.
It is, and
Mormonism.
right. Well, and the way that they, weave together in your book seems so almost effortless. I mean, I can imagine that it must have been a lot easier to kind of braid those together because you were experiencing those things kind of at the same time. That it feels much more personal than just this cerebral, oh, I'm going to compare these interesting characters. It definitely comes across as very, very personal. And I can see that, you kind of weave together these strands. I can almost count like 3 or 4. There's Shakespeare's heroines, your own experience, your relationship with your mother. There's parallels with Heavenly Mother. And then also with early Mormons, you have some ancestors who practice polygamy. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
And I can see all of those woven in there. And it's really marvelous how you're able to weave these together in just such interesting ways. I think that's wonderful.
Thank you. Can I tell you a story?
Yes.
Since Tyler's here. There are a couple of epigraphs in this book from an ancestor of mine, Charles Ramsden Bailey.
Yes.
And he also appears in my first book, If Mother Brings
I was wondering about that because I've read that one. It's very good.
Sister, but I sent the manuscript of this to Tyler, and I don't think it's fair that he's got his camera turned off. We should be able to see his reaction.
His reaction.
Sorry about Tyler. There we go. Tyler.
Fine, there you go.
What?
You remember I sent the manuscript of this book to Tyler to get some feedback, and he responded within a couple minutes. Do you remember what happened?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
He's like, wait, you're related to Charles Ramsden Bailey?
Shut up. You guys are like cousins.
We're cousins.
Oh my gosh.
How?
I love it.
Yeah. Yep. Different wife, but same dude.
No. Same wife, different son.
Yeah. That's right.
Yeah. So he had
Wow.
3 wives, Susanna, Joanna, and Hannah, and we're both descendant from Charles and Susanna, first wife. Right?
Yeah.
Right.
Sounds right.
Wow.
That's what you said at the time, man. I'm holding
Yeah.
you.
No, that is what I said. Which was
And then
I have to tell you this now though. When I read When Mother Braids a Waterfall, like having those pictures staring at me on every page, it was a really how do I say it? Intense, not intense, but it was a very like intimate experience when I was reading that whole book, because my ancestors are staring up at me from the page, and I was like, holy cow, it was trippy.
Yeah.
Wow.
We pulled out. There's a picture in my book of the 19 sons
Oh
of
my goodness.
Charles Ramsden Bailey and his various wives, and I think we figured out that you were from Aylmer over here, and that my dude is back here, John. Anyway,
So is there like a poetry gene then that you guys happen to get?
yeah.
Maybe it's the recessive one
Yes,
that
we'll
only
go with
comes
that.
up every now and then.
Yeah, so you're probably related to us too, Liz. Maybe do a little family history.
Oh, I doubt it.
To Charles Ramsden.
I mean, if I'm related to any pioneers, it's like way up the tree and way down the tree. So no, I'm pretty Southern.
Okay. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, that was I think that's the first time that I was like really excited about polygamy.
Because
Kind of
it's
cool. I'm gonna
fodder
be
for your work.
Yeah. Well, like that connection to Tyler. I'm
Yeah.
like, oh, that's kind of serendipitous and cool.
Yeah.
Actually.
Wow.
Anyway.
Okay, Mormon, we're getting smaller as always. So Dayna, I wanted you to share a little bit about some of your creative process, and I know you kind of went through this not metamorphosis, that's probably too strong a word, but in your MFA program, and as you worked on these, and to talk about some of the forms that you decided on. You have a variety of forms in the collection, and I noticed a lot of them kind of seem like assemblages, especially the ones where you talk about colors, the shades of hues of blue, things like that. So what kind of drove you to choose those different forms or play with those forms? Was it just experimentation, or was there something in particular that you felt was appropriate?
I think I'm a little bit of a restless poet. I like to try new things. I do like to experiment. I was certainly being encouraged to try new things in my MFA program.
Absolutely.
And I will say, I know that MFA is not for everybody. I've heard some people say that MFA for them was actually caused a lot of harm. And they spent years trying to recover from an MFA experience
Goodness, I haven't heard that before.
Have you only heard MFAs praised and held up?
Kind of. I mean, not to belabor my own questions. I have a master's, but I have considered getting an MFA. It just doesn't feel financially worth it at this point in my life. But I haven't heard horror stories, so do tell.
Yeah, I have. I've heard of poets taking years to recover from the workshop experience, having that be like really a silencing, um,
Mm.
critical, vulnerable in not a good way experience for them. That was not how I experienced my MFA. I felt encouraged and supported, and just I continued to be mentored by the person who chaired my MFA thesis, Bruce Beasley.
Mhm.
Is a wonderful poet, and I feel really lucky to have him as a mentor in my life. We're
Mhm.
actually reading together from, he has a new book coming out, and I have this book coming out, and we're going to read together on Shakespeare's birthday. So
Oh, that's
I
awesome.
feel like this continuation of support and
And
mentorship.
support.
I forgot your question.
That might happen a few times tonight. Experimentation,
Oh,
what made you
yeah.
choose those forms?
Yeah, so I feel like Bruce experiments a lot. My poetry professors were showing us a wide variety of forms, and I just I like to try new things. I start feeling like if I'm writing, well, that's not true. I wrote a lot of self-portrait poems in this
Hmm. Which are
collection.
all
So
great,
thank
in
you.
my opinion.
I do sometimes fall into like this rut of, oh, this thing is working. I'm gonna continue to experiment with this
Yes.
form. But I also feel really restless in a lot of ways. But I had a lot of fun with those color poems. I'm glad that you
Yeah.
brought those up.
Yeah.
Um, do you ever feel like when you have a blank page in front of you, just intimidated and not
Every
knowing where?
time. Every time. I can't start with a blank page. I have to start with raw materials. I
Yes.
have to.
So the color poems in particular, for example, the self-portrait as Ophelia in 33 Hues of Blue, I
Yeah.
made a huge list of different shades of blue.
Yes.
And I read through Hamlet and pulled out some lines, many more lines than what appear in the poem.
Hmm.
So I had a list of blue terms, I had a list of Shakespeare quotes from Hamlet, and then I also generated some of my own phrases, and then moved those pieces around like a
Right.
collage, more like collage.
Yeah.
And it was a
Yeah.
lot of fun. I think of them as like word mosaics.
Hmm. Hmm.
Uh,
Yes.
yeah.
Well, it's very validating to see that because I feel like so many poems I read, they just flow so well. And you think, did that really just come, was that born out of your head like Aphrodite? It's so not fair. I have to work really hard to dig and scrape and find things. And some of my favorite poems that I've done are things that I have found and put together, and instead of trying to just be brilliant on the blank page. Yeah. um yeah, well, and they do, they're very powerful. I again, I'm can't be complimentary enough. The other question I wanted to ask you about technique, I see that you use a lot of slashes within the lines, almost as if you're breaking without breaking. And I wanted to ask you about that. Like, what was that just something you were playing around with? Is there some kind of concept behind it that you felt, I don't know, emphasize the characters, or um, what what prompted you to use that?
Yeah. Um, I think I use those backward slashes a lot in poems like Anagnorisis in the Green Room. There's a feeling or a mood that is kind of hiding away in that poem.
Mm,
Uh, mm, Putting on a fictive skin, of stepping into character to not be seen. And
mm,
I feel like the slashes on the page give the poem a sort of feeling of enclosedness
mm,
that hopefully mirrors the content of the poem.
mm. Yeah, I
It's
was thinking, to me, it was like a way of, um, it's almost being breathless, that to have those breaths so often would indicate like this emotional mood, I guess. But again, that was my guess. I'm like, is that what's going on there?
I think that's a good guess. I think that's a good guess, honestly. Yeah, it could feel very breathless if you read a breath for each of those breaks,
Yeah.
or each of the backslashes, which is how we indicate a line break when we're not doing a line break. If you're like quoting the
Writing
line of
prose.
poetry, right? Then
Mhm.
then you'll put a backslash to indicate that there's a line break there. So yeah, you could read them as a breath, and that would actually feel really breathless.
Mm.
Which maybe also works for the feeling in that poem of discomfort,
Mhm.
dis-ease with the self, with the poem is about stepping into character, telling the story through a persona, through a character rather than directly.
Mhm.
And so I think that works. The
Mhm.
breathlessness being sort of an
Mm.
indicator of being uncomfortable.
Yeah, one of the ones that I loved was Hermione is Phantom Limb, Limn. And I love how you use puns in so many of these and the wordplay so often. Uh, oh, where was the line? Well, and it goes along with the other poem that you were just mentioning. My blame, I self. You're playing with syntax as well. To have all these double meanings about the character, but also the you as an author, and how you kind of relate to these characters. Blame, I, Oracle, slow, grace. And I love, especially because there are these, strands of Heavenly Mother and presence there that when you're playing with language, it's almost like trying to, recover whatever matriarchal influence we might have had and subvert that patriarchal, Shakespeare, the father of English language, influence. So yeah, I love seeing that kind of experimentation. I, personally tend to be very follow that narrative line, and I love seeing people play with that.
You're doing a really cool thing, Liz, that I didn't in fact intend, but I love it.
Okay.
I'm definitely in the Hermione section, in the third section of the book, or second section of the book, where I'm thinking about the Winter's Tale and Hermione and Perdita, and that reclaiming the mother and trying to reconnect with the lost mother. I hadn't
Yeah.
thought about God the Mother,
Mm.
but I
It's
really
there.
like that. I really
It's
like
there.
that
I mean, the thing is,
interpretation.
there's so many places where you're talking about, and maybe it's because I'm reading it in the context of all of these Heavenly Mother poems you've written, But I mean, she's there. Isabella speaks in achromatics. You're making her speak when she doesn't speak in the play. Um, oh, she's there. And,
I Yeah, and just because I wasn't consciously thinking about it doesn't mean that it wasn't seeping into my unconscious, because I
yeah.
am, as you know, I'm very interested in the feminine divine.
Yes.
That is a continued interest and obsession for me.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I love that reading.
Oh, great.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you one more question and then see if you wanted to read one of your favorites from this collection. The last thing I wanted to ask you is there something in this collection, some kind of strategy or motif or whatever it is that you wanted to maybe brag about or share that you think maybe most readers might not pick up on? Because I know I tend to be worried about that. Like I don't want to spell it all out. I want people to do the work when they read the poems. But then I wonder if people are going to pick up on it. So is there anything that, you wonder that people are picking up on?
Um, I mean, I there are definitely things that I put in the collection that I fully trust that I think readers are smarter than I am. I mean, you have this beautiful interpretation of God the Mother in that second section that I hadn't really thought about or intended, but I love it. So I actually think that readers are going to bring all different kinds of interpretations to it that I maybe didn't intend, but that I welcome and love. Once it's written and once it's out there,
Yep.
I'm no longer in control.
Right. The author's dead.
The reader's making meaning from the text, and that is a beautiful place to be. I will say that something that I tried, and you already mentioned this, that there are color poems in each section. And I really struggle to organize books. I love writing a poem, but organizing it into a series that makes sense. Oh my gosh, it's so hard.
Well, and there's so many.
Yeah. It is a long book. So something that helped me was to think about the mood or the tone of each of the 5 sections. The book has 5 sections, like a 5-act play of Shakespeare's, which I'm sure people will immediately catch on to. But something that helped me organize the book was to think of the mood of each section and to use the color poems as kind of anchors for those moods.
Yes.
So the first
I'm taking notes here because I have to do a review. I'm like, oh yes, let me write that down. Is that allowed? Yes, tell me what to say, Dayna. That's
brilliant. Yes, do it. The first section focuses on green, as in innocence and youth and greenness, and blue, the sorrow of the faith crisis, the sorrow of losing the mother and loss. The second section is purple, which is my mom's favorite color. So that's that part of that reclamation. And the purple also of loss and wounding and bruises and deep pain. The third section is black and white and gray, mixing those together. Isabel speaks of achromatics.
Yes.
Fourth section is red, is anger and rage and birth.
Lady Macbeth.
Lady Macbeth. And then fifth section is yellow. Rebirth, Titania, fairies, joy.
Fabulous.
Yeah. And that helped me organize the poems a little bit. It makes sense to me. I hope that the mood, the flow of the poems makes sense to readers as well.
Yeah. Well, they're beautiful. They're very, Andrew was joking earlier, and I fully concur that, I have to go to Google for this. So who's Jessica again? Oh, wait, I didn't read that play. So let me do some research. So you do have to, it helps you brush up on your Shakespeare. And there are definitely some plays I'm like, I need to watch that one. That's a great story. I need to go back to that. Yeah, just so many marvelous things in here. Fun with language and very moving. Yes, I highly recommend it to our readers out there. Thank you. And in a minute, we're going to return to you and have you guys talk about Mormon poetry. Wanted to give Tyler some time now to talk about his book that came out a few months ago. Tell us a little bit about the book. Tell us what went into its creation. It's called Litany with Wings. And they read, so many of them, they read like prayers. I mean, I think most poems, it could be considered prayers. There are desires and our things that delight us. So go ahead and share a little bit about your book and what went into that.
Oh, yes. Make me follow on Dayna's awesomeness there. So it's Litany with Wings, like you said. It released last April, so April 2022. So I'm coming up on a 1 year book anniversary. So it basically, the book, it does have a lot of, like you say, sort of prayers of meditations in it. So it kind of takes up poetry as a petitionary act, sort of meditative space and reflection on a lot of things. Like a lot of, it sort of follows a story, like a narrative, if you will, sort of an overarching. So from the beginning, in the beginning to like Apotheosis, like through a life, the emergence of life, and then life on earth, and then godhood, stuff like that. So that's kind of a general like narrative of what happens in the book. But along the way, I meditate on like the things that happen in life. I was really preoccupied like through a lot of it with a lot of the earlier poems with notions of fatherhood and being a spouse. Because I started
I did
writing
a lot of that with
it.
like gender roles and identity that figure in the beginning.
Yeah, very much. That was, and especially like the earlier poems, like I said, because I was a young father when I started writing a lot of those poems, and that probably comes through. So as I was trying to develop as a dad and as a husband and just as a man, trying to figure out what my space was and how my story was developing differently than the traditional roles should be for a dad.
Yeah, there's so many funny poems in there too about, I think you're checking out groceries and someone's like, "Oh, you're playing mom today." It's like, I guess.
Actually, no, I'm not, but whatever. Okay. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I like that poem. I like all the poems, of course, but so yeah, that's kind of, well, overview of what's in there. Lots of prayers, lots of I guess the big thing that readers will also notice is that there is a lot of meditations on art and artworks.
Yeah, there are a lot of ekphrastic poems that are really impressive. I kind of wish there were illustrations in there, but
Yeah.
that's a whole
I do have,
conversation.
yeah, massive. I didn't have that much money, but there is actually online on my website, there's a digital companion, so readers could go there and look up the images that go with the poems, sort of kind of follow along there. Unfortunately, I didn't get that up until after the book was released, so there's no hint of it in the book. So that
Well,
was a missed opportunity.
those of you who are watching, now you can go to Tyler's website and click on the digital
Go
companion.
look it up.
And I was curious about, when you were doing the ekphrastic poems, do you feel like they're easier or more difficult than some of your other poems?
That's a good question. I don't know. In one sense, it's kind of easier because I turned to the poems as an object of meditation. But they're also harder, or sorry, the images, the artworks as an object of meditation. But they're also harder because I didn't want to just, describe the painting. I
Right.
wanted it to be a response to or thinking alongside what the artist was doing. So that
Kind of a
was,
jumping off point.
yeah. And so it's not just, oh, here's what is
Here's what it
happening
looks
in
like.
this picture. This is what it looks
Right.
like. So that's probably the difficulty there. The easier part was finding inspiration in them. And I have way more that I started and didn't finish,
Didn't
but
finish.
that didn't make it into the book. But there was a lot of that. So
Yeah, there are so many great concepts in here. You've got a lot of pastoral poems, and I was really interested in. You have a section where you're writing to your younger self as a missionary. And I gather from the context that you served in New Zealand.
Correct, I did.
Okay. Um, and that you're incorporating some of the beliefs of the Maori people, the concept of koru, is that how you say it?
Yeah, the koru. Yeah.
Yes, and I mean you've got a very helpful kind of appendix, sorry, um, a section at the back of your book about some of those beliefs, which I thought were really interesting, especially what is called the sneeze or the breath.
Yeah, the sneeze of life.
Yeah, talk about that for a minute, how those concepts figure into your either your identity or LDS theology, or what was it that made you kind of latch onto that and use those as a motif?
Well, when I was there, feels so long ago now. It was a different life. But when I was there, I was fascinated by a lot of these ideas, and especially like the richness of Maori carvings and artwork. And I didn't really get into a lot of it when I was there, but when I came home, I started thinking more about some of the mythologies behind it. And in one of my poems called Te Kore, which is Maori for the nothingness, there's a line in there where I say something about an orgy of mythologies. And so I saw myself pulling from all of these different mythologies and holding them together, not trying to like mute any of them, but to let them inform the way that I see the world. And to not, you ask about how it relates to LDS theology, to Mormonism. I think sometimes there can be a tendency to use that theology as a way of encompassing everything else and overshadowing the uniqueness of the mythologies.
Yeah.
But I wanted to allow the other mythologies to shape, and other religious traditions, spiritual traditions, to shape the way that I was practicing poetry and thinking about God and the acts of worship and creation. I mean, so the Maori mythology became a really rich space for that, especially as I learned about the koru. Became fascinated with that idea, the unfurling fern frond, so the roundness of it. Fascinated by the idea of the spiral and what that, how that relates to just life and language and the tongue, what the tongue is doing when we're speaking, all those things. So it became kind of a fascinating object to meditate on and to use as a starting point for poems and something to come back to. So
Yeah, I love that. And I probably haven't mined some of these poems as much as I could have, but I love the juxtapositions of these other faith traditions, and being able to kind of what's the word I want? I don't know, freshen up some of the way that we tend to take for granted the way that we relate to the divine, as in our theology, that there are other ways of encountering it that can like you said, inform the way that we see things, the way that we interact with God.
Well, as you're saying that, I'm thinking of the idea of holy envy. And I see these traditions and I'm like, oh, it amazes me, and it again reshapes how I would like to worship myself in ways, or how I would like to be praying or thinking about God. So there's that sense of mine isn't the best one or the only one, and what can I learn from these other traditions?
Yeah, I love that. Let's see, what was the other, here are my questions. My brain is getting tired already. So your creative process. First of all, I have to comment that yes, when I pick up your book, I'm like, let me get my dictionary immediately. And I do
Yeah.
not ever want to have to play Scrabble with Tyler Chadwick because over and over, I'm like, I mean, do you just already know these words, or do you go, oh, here's a good word, I'm going to work this into a poem? Because it's quite impressive, and I have a new list of words that I'm going to start using. Um, but does it come easily for you, or is that something that you really work on? They're very condensed. They're very condensed. I
Yeah.
really have to slow down, which is good. I mean, it's good to make your reader do that. But that's definitely something that I have to do. So I think that's, I don't know if it's unique, but it's not common. Um, I don't know. Do you want to share and talk about that?
I think part of that is I'm thinking about like the very first poem in the book is it's one in a smaller series of poems called Desiderata, and there are
Mhm.
multiple entries in it. And the first one is called Obsession. Um, and part of that, I wanted to start off with that one because the book sort of represents or performs my obsession with words and language. Um, I just I love words. I love language. So as a poet, that works well for me.
Yep.
And like I'll hear a word, and I love how it sounds. I like to put it together with another word and see how they play off of each other. But a lot of what happened, I think, when I was writing the poems was like I'd see a word when I was reading something else, and I'm like, oh yeah, maybe I can use this in a poem. Like, what does it mean? In what context would it work? And a lot of also what happened was as I was writing and revising, I would the word didn't feel right. I didn't like how it sounded. I didn't like
Right.
how it came out or came across on the page. So I would go to my dictionary, on the most used app on my phone is probably my dictionary app. But I'd go there and I'd look through words and I'd try to sort of plug and play, like which one will work
Yeah,
here,
which one
which one
sounds
gives me
right?
which one sounds right, and which one also
Yeah.
gives me the nuance in terms of
Yes.
meaning and connotation that I wanted in the poem. So it's always as I'm writing, it's always a process of refining like what I want to say. Is like, is this the right word in this moment? And even up
Sure.
to the moment,
Wasn't it Hemingway who said, the hardest thing about writing is picking the right word? I'm not sure if I
sounds like something
attributed
he
that
might say.
correctly, but some famous writer, that's what they said.
Yeah, somebody famous said that. Well, we can second it. I agree with
The
that.
right words in the right order. I think that was
Yep, the
what it
right
was.
words in the right order. Uh-huh.
Something like that. Yeah,
Yeah.
we'll go with
Yeah.
that.
So
Well, I think
sometimes
you
I'd
did a
start
great
with a
job
cool
of picking
word.
the right words in the right order.
Oh, thank you. Even though I
Um,
hear from so many people who pick it up, they're like, "Whoa, these are big words. I can't. These are hard poems."
do you feel like they represent your personality? Like, would someone picking this up go, oh, that's definitely Tyler? Or they go, whoa, man, where'd you pull those words out of?
That's interesting because I've kind of talked with my wife about this a couple of times.
Uh-huh.
Because like I'm a pretty playful guy. I tease other people all the
Uh-huh.
time, probably too much. Um, and like I don't use words like this in my everyday life, even as a teacher. Um, and so like people walking down the street, they wouldn't think, oh, that guy's a poet. Um, and so that's one thing my wife points out to me. She's like, she said, what was it? Something about like sort of how like I can't believe you're a poet or something like that because it's so like it doesn't fit with these other
Because a
aspects
poet
of
is
who you
serious.
are. Yeah, poet is serious all the time, and is these things like, you don't look like a poet, you don't look like the nerd, you're whatever. Um,
Right.
but when you get to know me, I guess you can see me in this, or see this in me a little bit, because I do like to have deep conversations about things with people, about ideas that I feel like are important, and I don't do that with everybody. So this is the part of me that I would like people to see if I was, well, if I was good friends with more than like two people
Right.
in my life.
Right.
So
Yes, I can appreciate that.
yeah, because I'm very introverted,
Mm,
and I have a core group of friends that they know more levels of me. So
right. You can have deeper conversations. Yeah, I get
mhm.
that. Um, so, is there anything that you hope that people will pick up on in your collection that you wonder if they might not? Or something that you want people to, if they get your book, go to this place and read this one.
Read this one.
Yeah.
Um, I was thinking about this earlier in preparation for this, but like the big one, and this probably comes through, is just that I'm tinkering with thinking about playing around with the idea of apotheosis, like what it is,
Mm,
what it would mean to be a maker on that scale, even here and now as we're making. So in both the form and the content, I'm playing around, I think, with that idea of godhood, of divinity, what it looks like to have some divinity in us, maybe, and to
yeah.
use that to worship. Another thing that I think kind of works its way into the book is that Dayna talked about faith crisis, faith journey. But this sort of, it represents sort of a deconstruction for me, deconstructing a lot of my previously held beliefs and
Mhm.
reconstructing them in new ways. So that
Yeah.
ongoing process of
Sure.
sort of, how do I say it? So moving away from God, or learning to see God in a different way, and reconstructing that concept using the different aspects of my life.
Yeah.
Um, and so that, I mean, that's part of one thing that they'll see in the poem. And there's one poem in particular where they might, Dana actually pointed this out to me when she was reading an earlier version of it. There's a poem where I'm meditating on one of J. Kirk Richards' poems called Harvest. I
Hmm.
can't remember or Every Knee Shall Bow. I titled my poem Harvest, and his is called Every Knee Shall Bow. But it's this beautiful image of, there's a Christ figure at the center, and there are people bowed down, sort of like a field of wheat. So it's sort of white and golden. And I think about the idea of, Dana talks about a shipwreck, and I talk about being in there, sort of surfacing in this flood of people, sort of drowning in it, and reaching up to grab the hem of the Christ figure. And um, so that sort of, I guess, could be a space where I'm reaching, trying to reconstruct these ideas about godhood, to hold myself up from sort of drowning in it all as I
Yeah.
try to understand what it's all about.
Yeah. That's a good analogy. It can feel like that sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a particular poem that you wanted to read from your collection that you, I don't know, feel particularly proud of or wrestled with or any of that? And then after, I'm going to go back to Dana and have her read because I neglected to give her time for that. So
Oh,
we're just going to edit that part.
shame on you.
I know, got sidetracked. Um,
Okay. Yeah, I was thinking about this earlier, and I thought it would be fitting, since this is the dialogue book podcast, um,
mhm.
to read the most recent version of a poem that was originally published in dialogue. It
Okay.
was actually the first poem I ever had published in 2006. So the original version was 17 years old, but it's
Wow.
gone through different iterations since
Sure.
then. And so this now it was originally titled Fruit, appeared in I think volume 39.3 of Dialogue. I could be wrong on that. But now it was originally a triptych, so three different parts, and I didn't like what was happening in the other two, so I cut them out, and now it's just a diptych. I added another section. I cut two out and then added one in, but it's called Diptych to a Former Self, Seeking Eden, and I just want to read the first part. It's called First Fruits.
And this is on
Um,
page 51 in the book, if
yeah, page
anyone.
51.
Okay.
How to hear God's voice. Take your wife's hand as she reclines on the table, her bare abdomen a tight dome beneath the doctor's roaming touch. Believe his witness of your daughter. She's like an apple in a water balloon. Lean against the sentence, settling into consolation and release from the worry stirred by the car accident. Turn to the monitor. Watch your fruit embellish the screen, her shameless repose, her pulse, her fluid breaths submerging the room, baptizing you in grace and expectation. Sound out her heart's insistent whispering, trill with syllables translated from the knowledge tree the autumn God called on Adam and Eve and asked why their seed was so suddenly ripe with blood. So some of the original poem still lives in there, but
Mm-hmm.
I changed to I was speaking to, of course, to a former self again, to that young father.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that, like, the thing that really stirred that poem was that statement from the doctor. She's like an apple in a water balloon. Set my mind. I couldn't let it go,
Right?
so I, of course, wrote about it.
Yeah. Fabulous. Um, yeah, one of my favorites actually was oh, what is it called? I wrote it down. To the guy in the red hoodie. That's not the
Oh,
title
to the
of it.
man in the red jacket.
Yes,
My
not
wife's
hoodie.
favorite
You
too.
didn't use the word hoodie. Um, oh, it's so funny that the way you ended that. But readers, you'll just have to go read it. You'll have to get the book and read it. It's very
Yes,
funny.
yes, do that.
Um, well, thank you for sharing with us.
Of
And I do
course.
want to go back to Dayna and have her read a poem, which we can luckily edit that transition. Uh, apologies to Dayna.
Or not,
Um,
or not. Just leave it.
no, please, please, please. Um, and I cannot even remember now what time we started, but it's already 10 o'clock. So I want to have Dayna read a poem, and then we'll jump into some discussion about Mormon poetry.
I think I have to read a poem with a Charles Ramsden Bailey epigraph.
Okay.
Um,
Grandpa?
yeah, great, great, great grandpa. This poem is called Self-Portrait as Cordelia, Mormon Polygamous Wife. And the first epigraph, there are two epigraphs. The first epigraph is from Charles Ramsden Bailey. And I say, if plural marriage or celestial marriage is not true, then Mormonism is all a hoax.
Dun, dun,
And
dun.
dun, dun, dun. Great, great, great grandpa. And then the second epigraph is from King Lear. Meantime, we shall express our darker purpose. Know that we have divided in three our kingdom. So the poem is in three sections for the three
Of course.
kingdom. 1. Delia, he calls me, as if his mouth were too full of names to twine the full of mine around his tongue. We are trefoil clover, latched to the same stem, fixing nitrogen, converting it to the stuff of life, but now I've become the tearaway leaf, far from my husband's affection. Third, the put-away wife, distant as rooster from roasted hen. He used to hold me close, proud of my lace, my waves of lavender-scented hair, the crisp of my bun and starched linens, the way I can make a meal of a willow branch, boiled pigweed and thistle greens, corn cake, or a skillet of sego lily bulbs, the way I churn out sun after sun like pads of stamped butter with his milky impression. 2. Then my niggling questions surfaced. Why father-son spirit, a male-only guild for a godhead? And is father the great polygamist with many goddess wives? And why not prophetesses in Zion, Miriams and Deborahs and Annas? I let slip from the pantry the mouse of my doubts, let its warm brown scurry into the open, and find myself shelved, long languishing in a rough valley. Chicory and bitter herbs in my garden grow parched under desert sun. Come harvest, I'll glean grain enough to sell, sew a dress of linsey woolsey, dye the cloth with rabbit brush for yellow, then indigo for a summer green to reap again his gaze. Or maybe I'll begin with madder and a mordant, less likely to fade. 3. He frequents first wife now, enlarged her log house with an upstairs room. I who care for him know she's low-burning coal in a brazier about to spill, a hearth flame without a screen, embers and ash wafting in the updraft. What she touches, she incinerates. Second wife's a cowhide copy branded with first wife's spite. I didn't swallow in marrying him. I'd sister wife them. Both have that glib and oily art of Pharisees, all whited sepulchres with rotting bones beneath. I may as well be in another country, far from his favor and broken faith. Love and be silent. I expect we'll still, all of us, share a grave.
Snap, snap. Oh yeah, I love this stamped butter. The mouse of my doubts escaping from the pantry. Fabulous.
Thanks, Liz.
Love it.
I'm curious, Tyler, if you've ever been to Charles Ramsden Bailey's grave. Have you been there?
Probably when I was younger.
Yeah.
Yeah, we used to do the family grave tour.
Yeah. There's a giant. I don't know if you remember this. There's a big obelisk.
Oh, of course, it's the obelisk.
Yes, where Charles Ramsden Bailey is buried, and all the names of his children engraved around the sides of the monument.
Wow.
And then there's three little headstones for each of his wives.
Oh boy.
Three tiny ones.
We do a poetry reading there. That'd be fun. Next time we have a Heavenly Mother anthology, we'll do it. It's great.
Out there in Wellsville.
Yeah.
Wellsville.
So let's talk for a few minutes at least about Mormon poetry, about Heavenly Mother, possibly. I know that you guys co-edited the anthology together, and I was curious about how that came about. Yeah, how did you guys come up with the idea for that? Whose idea was it?
It wasn't mine. I think the
I didn't,
contest was happening, the A Mother Here
yeah.
contest.
Okay.
And I think I was doing another project on my blog, like reading the poems from the contest and writing about them, or like just little short audio recordings of me reading them and then talking about them. And as I was doing that, like this idea started percolating in the back of my head. These poems need to be collected. So I don't remember who I reached out to first. Somebody. And I said, we need to do this. And
I feel
it,
like, I'm sorry to interrupt.
no, go ahead.
I feel like you reached out to me, and I was like, well, do you know that Marty, who was helping to run the contest,
Mm,
Martin
yeah,
Polito and Carolyn Klein were putting on the A Mother Here contest. And I was like,
yeah,
well, Marty is putting together an anthology of the poems. And then you reached out to Marty.
yeah. I don't remember if I reached out to Therick Jepson before that. It may
Oh,
have been all sort of happening at once.
Right.
Um, but then, yeah, like this needs to happen. And then Martin had done a lot of work and brought some of that with him, and then it just sort of got bigger.
Together.
Yeah, it was a fun project.
I I felt very fortunate that you reached out to me, Tyler. And I don't know if I ever said thank you for doing that because I felt honored
Well,
that you
good.
asked.
I was honored that you said, yeah, cool. You were like I just missed you for Fire in the Pasture. I like hadn't for some reason you never came up on my radar.
I think
And
I
then I
had
saw
just
you
started
I,
writing
yeah.
at that
Oh
time.
my
Yeah.
goodness.
Hmm.
And then I saw your stuff and I was like, okay,
Yep.
she's got to
We
do
need
this. And then it turns
something.
out that we're cousins. So
Yeah.
So I have a question then about, Heavenly Mother and the attention that it's got. And do you think that, it's just a trend for now? Do you think that it's going to blossom to something else? I don't know, what have you noticed about some of these conversations about Heavenly Mother as a subject matter? Your thoughts on that?
I mean, I hope it remains a topic of conversation. I think until there's a balance of feminine and masculine within not just Mormonism, patriarchy exists everywhere.
Yeah.
Uh, I think we need more balance,
mhm.
and so I hope it stays a topic of interest.
I think as I'm just sitting here thinking about the history of it, like what happened in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and then just the explosion that's happened in the 2000s and the 2010s. There's so many more people talking about it and more openly. And again, like Dana pointed out, that it's not just a concern or a topic of discussion within Mormonism, but more expansively beyond that. I don't see it going away anytime soon. It's just my thought is, how is it going to continue to develop, and what can poetry contribute to the conversation? And because I'm thinking about also a review that Susan Howe, Casually Meyer did of Dove Song for BYU Studies, and they said that it was what was the word they used? That it was an apocryphal book of scripture, and so the women or Heavenly Mother and the feminine divine being sort of not in the shadows or on the side, but I don't know that it will ever, within the patriarchal hierarchy and the system of the church and elsewhere, I don't know that it will ever rise up really within that. it's going to be in the margins, and the stories will come from the people who are kind of there. It won't be from the middle. It will be where I would believe the mother would be, like from the margins, thinking about it in the apocrypha, in the shadows kind of thing. So so I don't think I would hope, again, like Dayna, and I don't think that it's going to go anywhere. And I hope that it just continues developing and blossoming.
Right. And becoming more mainstream and less controversial. I mean, to me, it doesn't seem like something that should be controversial, but then
Oh yeah.
suddenly, oh, it is? Oh, okay. Shoot.
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
about that?
I've had experiences with that, just mentioning Heavenly Mother or testifying of, some bearing witness of the notion that they are involved in our lives, and people in my ward getting up in arms, and the bishop feeling like he needed to
Uh-oh.
have a
Bring you
conversation with
in?
me.
Oh dear.
Even though he was like, I agree with you, but I just felt like this happened. I was like, okay.
Oh dear. So, in addition to Heavenly Mother, I'm curious about what other trends you see in Mormon poetry, or what does Mormon poetry even mean? And part of the reason that we invited Tyler is because Andrew said, we're going to talk about Mormon poetry. I'm like, I don't really know anything about Mormon poetry. We need to get Tyler in here to talk about Mormon poetry. How do you define it? I know it can be defined as, you're a Mormon and you write, or you write about Mormon things. But I don't know. How do you feel about those definitions? Or is there even a need to say you're a Mormon poet if you're a poet?
I don't know. I do like to define it as broadly as possible, the way I like to define Mormonism as broadly as possible, to be as inclusive as possible.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm coming up on my 10-year anniversary of my separation from church activity, and I still consider myself a Mormon poet. It's the culture I was raised in. It
Sure.
shapes my worldview in multiple ways that I don't even perceive.
Yeah.
And so even if I'm not writing about explicitly Mormon topics, I still consider myself a Mormon poet. One of the reviewers for If Mother Braids a Waterfall, like maybe the harshest review, but I think their point was legitimate. It was like, why does it matter? Mormon, not Mormon? Do we need to label ourselves, or do we need to label it Mormon poetry? I don't know. I'm curious to hear what Tyler has to say.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's not a softball question at all.
No pressure.
Yeah, none at all. And this has been, like, in Mormon literature itself, the definition of Mormon, that modifier, has always been sort of a contested thing. Some critics define it one way, some define it another way. Some want it super narrow, some want it as broad as possible. I'm like Dayna. I fall into that latter camp as well, and that was the approach I took when I was doing Fire in the Pasture. Is I wanted it to be as inclusive as possible, so people from within, well, people whose experience with Mormonism was far-ranging. So I've got people in there who have held positions within high-ish positions within the church, served in stake presidencies, stuff like that. And then there are others who left long ago, but they're still consider themselves part of the fold, as it were. Because I think for me, the thing that defines a Mormon poet or Mormon poetry is that sort of the language of Mormonism infuses what the writer is doing. It's not that they're
Absolutely.
using Mormon terms; they don't have those shibboleths, as it were. Um, but the language of the culture infuses every aspect of their lives. And how could it not when like you're brought up in something that's as what's the word I want to use here, as potent and sort of life encompassing as Mormonism is, it's going to shape the decisions you make, the way you think about the world, and you can't get away from that. It becomes part of the language that you speak. um, so I don't know. That's no definition of Mormon poetry at all.
Mm.
But that's how I think about it. Is more broadly than why not make it more broad and be as inclusive? Because we're not. It's not like we have to. Well, it's not like we're using the poetry to. Well,
Proselyte.
yeah, to proselyte. That's the word I was looking for.
Well, and I think that's in a way it's kind of ironic because to me, when I think of Mormon poetry, it's kind of self-reflexive. It's insular, and there is kind of this insulated community of Mormon poets. I mean, we have our own press, and
Hmm.
outside of that, who are we? And I think a lot of people get into, literature because of this call by, the prophets that we're supposed to have our own Shakespeare's and our own this
Yeah.
and that. And I do think it's a little ironic that, if we're supposed to be this to the world, then why are we so insular?
Hmm.
And part of my thinking is maybe we need to stop acting like we have all the answers. Um,
Well, hey.
Is that, I know, right? I mean, we have a lot of answers, but the older I get, the more I feel like we have a lot more questions than I have a lot more questions than answers. And in order to have that influence, then we have to have a little bit more porousness into whatever Mormon poetry is. Um, but
Well, I think the fact that we're calling it Mormon poetry puts us in a certain place because sort of adjacent to the what we're supposed to call it. So it's not poetry from members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We're calling it Mormon poetry. So
right,
we're positioning ourselves in a certain way, even by thinking about it in those terms
right,
to begin
laying it
with.
down. Yeah.
Can I ask Dayna? So, what you say you still consider yourself a Mormon poet, uh, even though you're not actively participating in the church. So, and Tyler uh, gave some possible reasons why someone might want to do that. But I'd like to hear from you. Why do you? What is it what is the power or the draw or whatever it is that you still have an identity like that?
Hmm. Um, yeah. I remember when my brother, who left the church when I was younger, he went to college and he was called by his friends a Stormin' Mormon. And I was kind of offended by that. I'm like, he doesn't get to call himself he doesn't get that nickname. He hasn't been a member, he hasn't been going to church for a long time. And now I'm like, no, I get it. It's been 10 years. Gosh, how do I answer that question, Andrew? It's hard. I there's that saying that Mormons leave, but then they don't leave us alone. They leave, but they don't. I can't excise Mormonism from who I am.
Yeah.
It's my
It's your story.
ancestry.
It's your identity.
It's my identity. It's part of my family. It's part of my language. It taught me to love language. Like all that scripture study and digging into um, the beautiful King James Bible language, which was written at the time of Shakespeare, right? And
Yes.
you've got this adjacent, beautiful language that I was immersed in. reading deeply and close reading helped me to fall in love with language. There's a hopefulness, and I feel like a desire to do good and right in the world and be of service that I think are part of my identity that Mormonism probably shaped in me. Yeah, I can't get it out. I can't apparently stop writing about Mormonism and Mormon subjects.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So maybe looking at other poets, do you see either of you or all three of you, what is there any kind of commonalities? I mean, there's so many people doing so many different kind of things. Is there something that you see as a kind of a common theme amongst people who might identify as Mormon poets?
I mean, I personally don't write about Mormonism. I mean, I'm from the South. I'm way more of a Southern girl than I am, I don't have any pioneer ancestry. But I definitely write about, faith issues and the divine and how that, plays into the way I interact with the world. So, and more, there are more LDS poets who don't necessarily identify as Mormon poets. And I mean, the work is all over the place. So I don't know. Is it a club?
Well, let me ask, how about this way? So Tyler, you edited this collection of poetry in 2011, Fire in the Pasture. And so now it's been about a decade since then. Have you seen any changes, any evolution in the field since then? Or have kind of new, what evolutions have you seen since then?
One of the big things is just how the field has grown. Like it feels like there are a lot more of us out there. I want to use that term, or maybe it's just because, well, I don't know. Maybe it's because the anthology sort of presented it like this is still happening, and people started picking up on that, and it gave some people permission to start writing out of the tradition or to thinking about the tradition through poetry. But I mean, even just the fact that we have some presses who are still publishing Mormon poetry is it's huge to me, because poetry doesn't make money. I mean, people aren't going to pick up my book and do some light reading with it. So I think that's the biggest thing that I've seen, is just how expansive the field is and can be. And there's another poet who he reached out to me just recently asking for some advice on editing something else. And so just the fact that it's still going is a huge trend, and I think something to be happy about as a Mormon poet, and I feel like it's become so big. It's hard for me to keep track of anymore, because things pop up all the time, and I'm so involved in teaching right now and other things that a lot of it I feel disconnected from it in some ways, but so maybe that is, that's a big thing for me, is it's not one central, can't be one central thing anymore. There's different pockets of it happening. I don't know if that answered your question, but
that's great. Liz, anything else we want to ask on this subject?
Oh gosh. What are you working on now? I know there's a big lag time between getting something published and having had it created. And since then, I'm sure you're working on new things. So what is it there? Can you give us a sneak peek, or tell us what you're mulling over?
Go ahead, Dayna.
So I actually have another book manuscript that just was named an honorable mention for the Wishing Jewel Prize and came in as a finalist for the Light Scatter Press Prize.
Oh, great. That's
It-
amazing.
Yeah,
Awesome.
it is a collection of goddess poems, God the Mother poems, and a lot of them are poembroideries, where I'm bringing
Oh,
poetry and
right.
embroidery together. So I have the first poembroidery that I did here, which
Hmm.
yeah, could maybe be like the cover or something. I don't know. This is the back and it's kind of a mess, but yeah, so I'm experimenting with bringing poetry and embroidery together, and I've got a manuscript that I'm shopping around.
Awesome.
Yeah, impressive.
Doing better than I am.
Mm. I'm
I
not
feel like,
I'm
yeah,
not teaching as much as you are.
that's the huge thing. That's where a lot of my focus has been. Yeah, thinking about teaching and pedagogy. But I will say that, like a lot of my thoughts about poetry and language, they infuse my pedagogy so much that I feel like, well, when I'm teaching and creating curriculum, that's where my creative energy goes. And I get really excited about that. So that becomes sort of a poetic process to me, inviting my students into language. And maybe that's just an excuse for not writing, but I've also, like, I have ideas for books of poems, and I have a couple of other things. I've got some poems coming out in Dialogue, the next issue. Thanks, Liz.
Yeah.
And like a couple other things that were published elsewhere that aren't included in the book that could build themselves into another book. But like right now, again, my focus has been mainly on teaching, and I'm working on also a series of essays about Alma 32. I've got 3 in the works. I've presented 2 at conferences and presenting another one at a conference in May. One of them explores the notion of the mother tree, what the mother tree can teach us about language, how we interact with each other. And so they're poetic-ish critical essays where I'm thinking about what Alma's Sermon on the Seed can teach us about language use, and community building, stuff like that. So that's a big thing I've been focusing on lately too. And then other book ideas that I touch every now and then. But, so those are the 2 big things, teaching and Alma.
I love your essays, Tyler.
Oh, thanks.
I'm excited.
They are impressive.
Well, all right. I think we should probably wrap it up there. Thank you so much, Liz, for being the guest host of this discussion.
Yeah,
thanks,
thank you
Liz.
for letting me participate.
And thank you, Dayna and Tyler, for being with us and for all of your great poetry.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much.
And thank you to all of you for listening to the Dialogue Book Report. This show is produced and edited by me, with additional editing and music by Daniel Foster Smith. Our content manager is Emily Jensen. To hear more and find other great content like Blair Hodges' Firesides, interviews about religion and culture with brilliant people who will fan the flames of your curiosity, go to dialoguejournal.com for all of the Dialogue podcasts.